You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 14th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
China looms menacingly at Taiwan again. The US deploys a small number of troops to a foreign conflict, which has hardly ever worked out badly before. And how frightened should we be of 600-year-old poems? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hillo and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests James Rogers and Isabel Hilton will discuss today's big stories, and we'll find out about one bracingly simple solution for dealing with food waste. Eat it! Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and by James Rogers, associate professor of international journalism at City University of London. Hello to you both. Hello. Isabel, I understand that you have recently been in conclave with the shape-shifting lizard creatures from a parallel dimension who secretly manipulate human destiny.
Very accurate description. Yes, it was a conference in the Cotswolds on the state of the world, you know, that kind of thing.
That all sounds like a remarkably innocent explanation.
Utterly innocent.
Did you all at any point daub yourselves with woad and worship a burning owl?
I couldn't answer for all the participants, but certainly I didn't do any burning owls, no.
That does.
I did miss the first afternoon, so I might have missed that.
Yeah, there you go. It's always the way with these things, like, have I missed the owl?
Is it worth going?
But basically, though, Isabel, is everything getting sorted out or not?
Everything's fine with the world. I don't know why you even ask.
Oh, okay, good, excellent. Well, we know who's responsible if it's not. James, you have recently been, and I remember enough of the Cold War, though I wasn't here at the time, to be able to recall a time when this would have seemed an incredibly exciting, even daring journey. But you travelled by boat from Vienna to Bratislava.
I did, Andrew, yes. As listeners may remember of my previous travels, I'm very fond of taking long-distance train journeys across Europe when the opportunity arrives and the time permits. And on this occasion, I was going to go to Bratislava, and I didn't really have time to go by train, but I made up for it by going from Vienna to Bratislava by boat. Fortunately, shortly after those terrible floods that devastated so much of that part of the world previously, but it was really, really interesting. And as you say, you know, a journey that would have been all but impossible during the Cold War. And still along the river, there are fortifications from various periods of history, you know, when it just reminds you what a contested part of the world that's occasionally been. But thankfully, it's possible to make the journey now, and I really enjoyed it, actually.
I am envious, because the last couple of times I've been to Bratislava for the GlobeSec conference, I was vaguely interested in trying to go one way or the other by boat, but time did not permit.
Yeah, and it's obviously, because I was going from Vienna to Bratislava, it's much quicker than coming back the way, because you have to, when the boat's going against the current, it takes a lot longer. But it was good weather, and it was really, really interesting.
Well, we will be starting the show proper in Taiwan, where sentries have lofted binoculars to monitor Chinese war games in the island's extremely immediate vicinity. It is far from the first such endeavour by China. It is the second, indeed, in the last few months. But this one appears not at all unrelated to a speech given last week on Taiwan's National Day by Taiwan's recently inaugurated president, William Lai. He pledged to resist, as he put it, annexation or encroachment on our sovereignty. This was not warmly received by China, which continues to insist that Taiwan is a temporarily stray province, whatever anybody who actually lives in Taiwan might think. Isabel, first of all, the drill does involve the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and I wish they'd shorten these descriptions. You know who I mean. I was trying to be proper, but it's the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force.
Indeed.
As far as we can tell, does this seem like a bigger deal than the sort of thing they do to annoy the Taiwanese all the time?
It is a bit, well, it's a bigger annoyance, shall we say. It covered all four sides of the island, including they sent the Liaoning, the aircraft carrier, which was actually a refurb from Ukraine, if you remember.
It was going to be a floating disco at one point.
Indeed, but the plan B was the aircraft carrier. It hasn't been entirely untroubled, but it's just been refurbed again. So that was on the east side of the island, which is the side from which reinforcements would come if they were to come. So essentially, there was an interesting quote from the PLA National Defence University, which essentially said that the drills were meant to show that Beijing could blockade all ports on the island whenever they liked.
That sounds like something we kind of already knew.
Well, we did, but they haven't demonstrated it quite so vigorously. And he went on to say that this was aimed particularly at energy, which I think they haven't said out loud before. And as you know, Taiwan has to import most of its energy. Certainly all the fossil energy is imported, so the coal, the oil, and particularly the LNG. And there isn't much margin in Taiwan's electricity supplies. We've had rolling blackouts, in the last few years. They have 6% nuclear, which the government has pledged to shut down, which they may have to revise, because it's really not clear how they're going to cope with the expanding demands of their very important high-tech sector, including new AI demands, with the current arrangements. And if they were to be blockaded and energy supplies were to stop, they would really quite quickly, they've got about 8 days LNG, they would really quite quickly get into trouble.
And there is, as there often is with military exercises, James, a theatrical aspect to this, because this is China also kind of saying to Taiwan and to the world, this is what phase one looks like.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, from what Isabel's just been saying, and this is clearly quite comprehensive and not actually, in terms of the relative strengths of the armed forces, that difficult to do or that difficult to demonstrate the possibility of doing should they want to do it in anger, for want of a better way of putting it. So it clearly, and the timing of it, again, after that speech, as you pointed out last week, and it just, this is something that's been people have been concerned about for the last couple of years and longer, particularly since the escalation of Russia's war in Ukraine. Lots of people pointing out that, in some ways China may well be watching very closely what happens in Ukraine, because if Russia is seen to prevail there, or at least to achieve some of its objectives there, then without significant Western obstacles being put in its way, then China might be tempted to do something similar. And obviously, the United States as well. All this speculation was being made before the war in the Middle East. So it is something that obviously that the Chinese are very keen to remind the Taiwanese of.
Isabel, President Lai of Taiwan doesn't seem daft, and I'm sure he's well aware of how those lines from his speech would have been heard in Beijing, talking about Taiwan's sovereignty, which, we are brandishing red rags at bulls here. Given that he knew that there would be a response and that it would not be a cheerful or amenable one, what did he hope to accomplish by saying that?
Well, it's worth pointing out that he didn't say anything that hasn't been said before. His predecessor said very much the same thing. And it's kind of the standard discourse of the DPP, which is a Taiwanese party, which is, premised on there being a Taiwanese identity and, Taiwan being its own thing and not just a province of China. So, he has to satisfy two constituencies when he makes his speech. He has to talk to his own party and he has to talk to the Americans. So he didn't push the envelope any further. But he did kind of hold his ground. We've just had the UN General Assembly and the kind of usual row about Taiwan's exclusion and the, China's escalating use of the One China principle to sort of cut Taiwan off from participation in almost everything. So I think, for a Taiwanese president, you have to say, we are a functioning country. We are a functioning democracy. We are important to the world, which they certainly are, and don't mess with us. And what China is saying, we often speculate, I think probably too much, on the cost of an armed, resisted invasion of Taiwan. And I've always felt that a blockade was actually by far the easier option, because it says to Taiwan's friends, the United States, Japan, South Korea, do you want to fight over a blockade? This isn't a war. If you make the first, kinetic move, you're starting the war, not us. And China's been very, very successful in expanding its control of, for example, the South China Sea or even the Taiwan Strait through the use of just sub-provocative manoeuvres, which don't justify an armed response. And I think this is one of them, and this is a very, very clear one.
James, you mentioned the comparison between Russia's attitude to Ukraine and China's attitude to Taiwan, and we have heard a fair bit about that these last couple of years for obvious reasons. But if you're going to do something like retrieve what you think is a temporarily rogue part of your empire, timing is always everything. And is it unimaginable that there is any part of China, which is now thinking, well, world, especially the United States, massively distracted by Ukraine and by the Middle East, effectively a lame duck president. There will be a new president in January who, if presented with a fait accompli, may not want to spend their entire first, or in one case next term, at war with China. If not now, then when?
Yeah, I think very much so. I mean, and that's presumably that's part of the calculation and the timing of this particular exercise. I mean, the other comparison with Ukraine, of course, is the massive economic disruption that would follow any such upscaling of the conflict or the confrontation. We saw the way that food prices rocketed because of, the reliance on wheat shipments and also, of course, on fertiliser from that part of the world. I think a lot of us learnt how much of the world's fertiliser was produced in Ukraine and Belarus, for example. And clearly in this case, the issue would be semiconductors, vast numbers of which are produced in Taiwan. So that might be a consideration, as some people are suggesting, that would lead China to think twice about anything, any direct intervention. But I find Isabel's scenario of a blockade highly plausible.
Just finally and quickly on this one, Isabel, because it is a thing that always intrigues me about these nationalist rallying points, often cranked up by self-serving politicians, whether it is a Serbian politician talking about Kosovo, a Spanish one talking about Gibraltar, or whatever. Were I to accost the median Chinese citizen of a median Chinese city, and assuming we could find our way around the language barrier, and I ask them, do you honestly, actually deep down where you live, care in the slightest about Taiwan? What would their answer be?
Probably not very much. I mean, it depends. I mean, if it's yes, they would care, but they'd probably care more about the cost of living and whether their son or daughter was going to go to a good university and whether they would have, anything in their old age. I mean, those are the things that people are worrying about right now. It's a bit like asking an Argentinian, in 1979.
Another classic of the genre.
Exactly.
Yes.
If they really cared about the Falklands, and they'd say, yeah, but hey, no, not for a war. No.
Well, let's move along with what appears to be today's theme of America's most incredibly easily solved foreign policy dilemmas. The United States will today be reassuring itself and anyone else paying attention that making minor deployments of American troops into the vicinity of an intractable and indeed largely incomprehensible foreign conflict hardly ever goes badly. A small number of US boots will be on the ground around an American anti-missile system deployed to Israel intended to deter or destroy any future barrages from Iran. James, this is the THAAD, as it is known, THAAD, your Terminal High Altitude Area Defence thing. It has been deployed in Israel before, but not with American troops. How significant is that in the current context?
I think this is very significant in the current context. I mean, the United States also has assisted Israel in missile defence with the previous Iranian attacks, but not, then this is the key difference, as you've pointed out, not actually with US troops on the ground, not with this system deployed there, but from warships and from warplanes, not actually in the territory of Israel. So I think, at the same time as President Biden is saying to the Israelis, don't go directly after Iran, there's talked about not striking at the nuclear infrastructure or the oil infrastructure. His possible successor, of course, giving different.
I mean, do you think it is do you think it possibly is as simple as seriously wind your neck in and I'll send you one of our anti-missile batteries?
It may be along those lines, but I mean, let's be honest. Benjamin Netanyahu has not been paying very much attention to
Not a
President
lot.
Biden's advice over the last year or so. So that may have been part of the deal, but whether that's how much that's going to actually influence Israeli policy is a completely different matter.
Isabel, fun possible future scenario, and I'm sure if this has occurred to me, it has occurred to the United States. Deliberately or otherwise, Iranian missile lands on this thing, American casualties.
Yes, that would be a bit of a problem, and that may be part of the calculation in sending them, actually, that Iran, which clearly does not want to get into a full-scale war with the United States, with Israel's one thing, with the United States is another. If you start damaging, killing American military personnel, you have a problem.
Yeah, especially with an election coming up.
Absolutely. I mean, I imagine that Biden would have to, do something, and we would all be in a situation that nobody wants. So it may be part of the deterrence or the thinking that Iran might hold off for fear of getting into precisely that situation.
I mean, do you think there is an aspect as well, though, of, even if it wasn't as straightforward, James, as the quid pro quo I suggested, that this is the United States trying to govern Israel's still undelivered response to the most recent Iranian missile barrage? I get the distinct impression the US is very keen for everybody just to call it a draw.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I also think you're right too that this is something of the United States is saying to Israel and to Iran, we are going to stand very firmly with Israel, and this is the form that support is going to take at the moment. More efficient defences. And hopefully then some sort of leverage over Israeli policy. But as I say, that has been very largely absent. If we go all the way back to the first responses to the Hamas attacks of October the 7th last year, President Biden counselling Benjamin Netanyahu at that time, reminding them of the mistakes that he said the United States had made in its rage after 9/11. And yet, I think if you look at Gaza then in the longer term, then Israel has arguably repeated some of those mistakes.
I mean, are there, do you think here, Isabel, as well, domestic political considerations for President Biden in play? I mean, obviously he is not standing for re-election himself, but he knows somebody who is. United States aid to Ukraine has become a ludicrous partisan issue. Obviously, the Republican Party is now strangely against helping European democracies defend themselves from Russian aggression. You live long enough, you get to see everything.
Indeed.
But would there be part of him thinking, well, let's see my conservative opponents try and argue with this?
Yeah, if there were to be a successful attack by Iran on Israel, the Republicans would certainly blame Joe Biden. It seems to me electorally, though, it's a tough call because, he's there is a large pro-Palestinian vote, which would normally...
Among his own base.
Absolutely. Would normally be enthusiastic Democrats. And I, particularly the more Israel goes after the United Nations, the more it goes, the more damage it does in brute. That speech Netanyahu made was essentially saying to the Lebanese, do you want to end up like Gaza? As though the people of Lebanon had any choice.
Precisely.
I mean, it was pretty extraordinary stuff. And I don't think that's going to do the Democrats any good either. But then who do you vote for if you're the Democrats?
Just finally on this one, James, before we move on to something else, and going back to the fact of the deployment itself, it would not be the first time in human history that somebody has sent what they say is going to be a very small number of troops and finds themselves some years later having somehow sent a very large number of troops. It is axiomatic that it's always easier to send people in than get them back out. Is there any danger of that here?
That's very difficult to say at this stage. I don't think so. I mean, but who knows how that region's going to progress. I mean, we have heard it many times said, and the way that things have unfolded over the last 12 months does tend to support this, that none of the major parties want an all-out confrontation, and yet, the war continues to open on new fronts, as we've seen in Lebanon in the last couple of weeks particularly.
Well, to Germany now, and a test of the proposition that justice delayed is justice denied. In March 1974, a Polish firefighter called Czesław Kukucza presented himself at the Polish embassy in East Berlin, claiming to be carrying a bomb and demanding passage to the west. Polish officials drove him to the Friedrichstrasse border checkpoint, but not before tipping off the Stasi, one of whose officers, Martin Naumann, shot Kukucza several times in the back from a distance of 2 metres, killing him. Naumann, now 80 years old, has been convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 years. This is not obviously the first time Germany has had to ask itself these sorts of questions, Isabel, but basically, is this fair enough? Does a man who carried out orders on behalf of a no longer extant state 50 years ago still merit 10 years in the clink?
10 years at the age of 80 seems...
It's a life sentence.
Yeah, absolutely. But and it's quite surprising because not that many Stasi operatives have been convicted. And on the whole, they've been convicted of manslaughter on the grounds that they were obeying orders. So
and of course,
this is an unusual case.
And astonishing numbers of people did work for the Stasi in some capacity or other.
And quite a lot of people were killed trying to get across to West Germany. I mean, the Germany used to have a statute of limitations on murder, and it removed it largely in order to continue to prosecute Nazi criminals. And so, there is no statute of limitations. But I still find the murder rather than manslaughter charge quite unusual.
The crime itself is dreadful, James, and when you read details of it, it's impossible not to be appalled. The man was attempting to leave an unpleasant authoritarian tyranny and go and live somewhere where he could live as he pleased, and he was, shot in the back from close range in cold blood. Yeah. But should there be a cut-off point? Because again, as I said, Germany, where this sort of thing comes up a fair bit, last year did convict, or in 2022 rather, convicted of murder a 101-year-old former SS NCO.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the cases when, I've only read media reports of the court case and the account that was given there. But just the nature of this man was, had been imagining good faith. Quite apart from the fact he'd made a bomb threat, which clearly, the circumstance of the thing were different.
The bomb, to be clear, was fake, but I take your point.
But, if you go into an airport and do that, see how far you get.
Well, indeed.
But the nature of this, I think, and this is presumably why the prosecutors pushed for the murder thing, is the fact that, this man was absolutely no threat to anybody. He was shot in the back. There was no warning. There was nothing. And this is the kind of thing that anybody, one would imagine in a law enforcement agency anywhere in a civilized country in the world, the person who fired the shots will be prosecuted in this case.
He was actually decorated at the time.
Well, indeed. So it's, but it is a very long time ago, and but I think it's astonishing. This, I gather, is largely down to the work of one particularly assiduous historian who dug out all the Stasi reports of it. So it's a remarkable piece of research in that sense. That his great interest in the Stasi archives has led to this outcome.
Is there a danger, Isabel, when you pursue the elderly in particular, and this is not at all to minimise their crimes, because the case to which I alluded earlier of Joseph Schutz, who was a former SS NCO who was associated with thousands of murders at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. But when you put a centenarian, you know what I mean? Centenarian, somebody who's over 100 years old in the dock, there is a very real risk of inciting a certain amount of sympathy for them.
Absolutely. And actually, I think that you can perhaps put people in the dock in order to remind people of the crimes, but you send a centenarian to prison. Honestly, what do you achieve? I mean, prison is, there are two objectives in sending people to prison. One is punishment and the other is rehabilitation. Well, you have to ask yourself at this point, what's the point?
Is there any argument, though, just finally on this, James, that punishing historical cases does serve some wider purpose of reconciliation? Proceedings are ongoing, for example, against the former soldier in the UK's parachute regiment, now known only as Soldier F, over the deaths at Bloody Sunday in Derry in 1972. Is that, if he is found guilty of murder and convicted, does that actually help in any way?
Possibly. I mean, I think it took an awful long time for the British government to concede what had actually happened that day as well, in that particular case. I mean, my thought in so many of these cases, including, by the way, the ones that are still ongoing from the Second World War, is why on earth did it take so long? Mm-hmm. You know, if the evidence is there now, it must have been even more there and more discoverable, you know, at any time really in the last 80 years.
Well, now to a doubtless welcome opportunity for all of us here gathered to indulge in a spot of sanctimonious harumphing at the sensitivities of folk younger than ourselves, one of very few consolations of getting on a bit, so let's make the most of it. At issue is the latest iteration of the modern fashion of trigger warnings. Cautions, that is, that a particular text or whatever may freight views at odds with those held by denizens of 21st century social media. In this instance, students at the University of Nottingham are to be solemnly cautioned that Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury tales contain interpretations of Christianity that may have been all the rage circa the late 14th century, but now not so much. James, you have interacted with students. Could your students cope with the Canterbury tales, do you think? Or might they faint dead away?
I'm pleased to say I don't teach English literature. I'm pleased to say that on this occasion. I'm very much
teach journalism. It's polar opposite.
Yeah, I do teach a module on the reporting of armed conflict in which I do use some quite disturbing content. So I do use I'm quite sure that the right-wing newspapers in this country would gleefully describe as trigger warnings. But I think when you are describing or showing video or still photographs of the consequences of war, then that's probably wise. Because they are distressing, and there may well be people amongst my students. I teach in a university in London which has got people from all over the world. There may well, and I know certainly that I've taught students who have grown up in conflict zones. So I think it's only appropriate to say that. And I always say before I show something like this, I warn people what it's likely to be, and say if anybody wishes to leave the room, then please do so. Chaucer, I think they could probably help with. And I think this is, I think, it is, as you say, Andrew, it's a chance for us to harumph about, young people and so on. But I think the point here really, one can have one's own opinion on whether this is an appropriate trigger warning or not. I think it's rather different from the cases in which I personally use them in my teaching. But I think the real concern would be if this content were being removed from the curriculum on the grounds that it was so deeply offensive. And if the warning is, in that sense, neither here nor there, but it's made a good story, as I say, for the right-wing newspapers in this country. Indeed
so. Isabel, there is a thing, though, and it's similar to what James was talking about. It has always been the case that films have had classifications that you will often hear newsreaders, and for as long as I can remember, saying the ensuing report does contain content which some viewers may find disturbing. I can remember Jon Snow on Channel 4 News saying that about a report of an England-Australia test match at one point. Clearly one that was going quite well for Australia. But this, it strikes me, is different. This is having to warn people that people 600 years ago had some ideas that you might find weird. Are you sure you can stand this?
Well, I think it's, for a start, if I remember my Geoffrey Chaucer, it's pretty difficult going, and if they get competent enough to detect that there are attitudes they don't like,
I understand this well enough that I'm upset.
Yes, absolutely. But the other thing, this whole thing inspired me to take a look, since I grew up in a trigger warning free era, in the late 18th century. What are trigger warnings actually for? Because all the psychological research on trigger warnings, it seems to show that they're rather negative. They don't have a protective effect. They re-traumatize people. People get more anxious. It doesn't put people off viewing content. It just makes them more anxious about the content they're viewing. So I think it's probably time to think, what are we doing here with trigger warnings, and shouldn't we perhaps rethink?
Does it make them more anxious about the content they're going to be viewing anyway, James? Or have you noticed that it actually makes people more interested in the content? I'm thinking that, again, the context is slightly different, but it's axiomatic in music business circles that during the 1990s, when record companies got pressured into putting warning stickers on Aerosmith albums saying warning adult content, they flew off the shelves. And I
bet the PR people were not unaware of that.
Well, exactly. And I can remember years ago asking Alice Cooper genuinely if he ever was able to quantify the effect of the efforts on his career of Mary Whitehouse to having banned from the BBC. And he just said it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. He said, like, the record went to number one, we sold out Wembley, and I sent her a big bunch of flowers.
It's difficult. I mean, I've never done any. I mean, I'm quite sure there is research on this. I must confess I've not read any of it in detail, and it's not something I've ever conducted amongst my own classes. But it's, as I say, it's something when it's going to be rather very similar to the example that you've given when broadcasters do that on the news, on broadcast news bulletins and say that. But I don't think. I guess very possibly there is a benefit. It does make the students pay a bit more attention. If perish the thought any student's attention ever wanders during my fascinating lectures. But as I say, I also don't remember a single occasion upon which a student has decided to leave the room, and I always leave a reasonable pause as anybody wants to do, so I don't just gallop through it and say, right, here we go.
But just finally on this one, Isabel, because I don't think we have baited Gen Z to the extent that is going to gratify the producer of this programme who put this item in basically trying to wind us up. Hi, Monica. Do you think anybody actually is really actually genuinely traumatised by the content of historical texts, or do they just kind of enjoy pretending they are?
Yeah, I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that anyone is. I mean, look, there are texts and there are texts, but I don't think Canterbury Tales is one of the ones that would traumatise anyone, as I said, even if they could understand it.
Isabel Hilton and James Rogers, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, 59 million tonnes of food waste is generated in the European Union every year. Ideas for disposing of it now include eating it, sort of. Andy Jones explains.
You may have heard the saying, you can't make good wine out of bad grapes. But in Rotterdam, one man is out to prove that is a pile of rubbish.
My name is Wouter Bell. I'm from Rotterdam Urban Winery. We make really special, crazy wines. I think most people don't believe it. They obviously think about where do the grapes come from.
Rotterdam Urban Winery is in a former warehouse built in the 1920s to store coffee and cotton arriving from the city's busy harbour. What it's never had is any vines or any soil.
Our terroir is like concrete and tarmac and cardboard and whatever, That's what I have to work with.
What he does have, though, is a huge amount of fruit.
472 million kilograms of grapes that are imported into the Netherlands every year. Somewhere between 1% and 3% of that amount sort of is thrown away every year. Sometimes grapes come in and they don't have the standard that they need to have. They are either too unripe, too ripe. But the thing is, if you have just a few boxes on one pallet that are not good anymore, then the whole pallet goes to waste. I mean, even if it's just 1%, it's like already 4 million, almost 5 million kilograms. What we do is we save grapes that would otherwise go to waste. So I sometimes call myself a grape guerrilla. We're trying to solve that and have a good tipple as well.
Wouter started out making a range of successful ciders, but once the port alerted him to the colossal wastage of grapes, it made him tweak his business plan. But how does Wouter, who works most of the time alone in his warehouse, turn humble table grapes into restaurant-quality wine?
Table grapes, compared to wine grapes, tend to have less character in terms of tannins. They're obviously without pits. They actually tend to be less sweet, which is an interesting fact. You would think they were sweeter, but like wine grapes have more like acidity and have more other flavors. But there are like so many ways that you can actually enhance or change the flavor profile. It can be with different types of yeast, it can be a wild fermentation, it can be barrel aging, it can be like carbonic maceration. I mean, I wouldn't even mind adding botanicals. Obviously for classical wine, it's not done. but we're certainly not a classical winemaker. Let's put it like that.
Rotterdam Urban Winery has lines in rosé and sparkling white already on sale in city bars and restaurants. Wouter aims to sell around 30,000 bottles per year, online and in bars. He is even making, in time for Christmas, a truly circular mulled wine, adding surplus spices from Rotterdam's botanical gardens and a local spice importer. Just so long as he can get hold of the right grapes.
Obviously, we're not going to make a Riesling, or we're not going to make a Merlot, we don't have those grapes, so we'll be making other wine. I see it as that we'll have a few lines that we'll always have and that are more or less the same. So what I actually do, if I need grapes, I just call them and say, okay, do you have what I need? I didn't get a no so far, so... Usually with sustainability, you're not allowed to do this, or you have to do that, or it costs like crazy amount, or, it creates boundaries. But I want to show that sustainability can be, fun.
Meanwhile, city slickers working in Bergen, Norway, might not be aware that for every espresso they down to get themselves through the day, they are inadvertently growing a part of their evening meal.
So it's pretty fantastic. Only 1 kilogram of coffee grounds actually make 200 to 250 grams of high quality gourmet mushrooms that are sold to restaurants. My name is Tina Charlotte Holm. I'm COO of Carrot, a startup trying to solve the world's waste problem with data. Our client is the shopping centre here in Bergen, Norway, where there are 3 coffee shops who participate by logging all of the coffee grounds they throw away. The producer, the mushroom producer, can also track how much coffee grounds have come in last week, this month, get a steady flow of production and get insight into how much they can expect going forward. So I just logged in now to see for fun from this one shopping centre with only 3 cafes, almost 100 kilograms of coffee grounds just last week. Should take into account that Norwegians are pretty extreme on this. So Norwegians drink actually 13 million cups of coffee every day. So keep in mind, we're only about 5 million people. So I think that's why Norway was a great place to start with this. That coffee grounds is as a useful fertilizer. This is something all of our grandmothers knew, right? They took the coffee grounds and put it on their plants in the garden. Kind of a knowledge that I think disappeared a little bit, and we forgot about that this is actually a valuable resource. I'm pretty sure it should be lucrative when you're able to scale it.
And scale it up they are. Carrot are already partnering with office giant Legal & General to offer similar services to its multi-billion-dollar office and retail portfolio. In the Bergen shopping centre, they are also helping recycle broken coat hangers and unwanted textiles into new garments and furniture. But getting under pressure shop staff, particularly those having to make complicated coffee orders at speed to put the used grounds in a chiller for maximum growing freshness, is not that easy. It takes a little scientific kidology.
We've tested a lot of different approaches on this nudging, gamification, and different angles. Together with the Norwegian School of Economics, they also did a lot of research on this. And one of the biggest contributors to making people want to make an extra effort is actually knowing that it makes a difference. As soon as you have this initiative where they know this tangible coffee grounds go to this mushroom farmer that you have seen the face of, and they can see the mushrooms, it's local, it's very tangible for them. Coffee grounds can be used for a lot. I read about people using it for like technical clothing, taking away smell for training clothes. You can make furniture from it. So coffee grounds have proven to be maybe the most interesting, but there's definitely much more to explore in this space.
Andy Jones with that report, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel Hilton and James Rogers. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.